Hey guys, Trey here. Wanted to do a forecast discussion on today's fairly widespread severe weather threat across much of the high plains. We have several different areas to watch for that we'll talk about in today's briefing. The first and most prominent of which is in eastern Wyoming into far western South Dakota and western Nebraska. Then there also could be a conditional threat at a storm or two down here along the dry line in eastern Colorado, which we'll take a look at after that. And then finally, we have another area, this slight risk down here in the Texas Panhandle southward toward the Texas Rolling Plains that could foster a few severe storms as well. So we'll take a look at all of these areas, break down the pros and cons of each, and see maybe pick some target areas if we were chasing today. So let's go ahead and start with the visible satellite. You can see very well developed low pressure system out here over Kentucky, Tennessee, rotating into the Carolinas, into Virginia as well. And we kind of have this sort of this leftover frontal boundary or baroclinic zone out here that extends all the way back into the Red River region. That will be a focus for severe storms today in the southernmost mode. You can see some cloudiness, low cloudiness along that baroclinic zone, but it looks fairly benign at the moment. If we zoom back out to the, let's see if we can just hit the back button here, yep. We also have a circulation up here in the low levels on the Idaho-Oregon border, excuse me. That is rotating eastward throughout the day. And we can see the sort of southerly fetch, southerly winds in the low levels here with these clouds streaming northward over Colorado, Wyoming, most of the central high plains region. Let's go ahead and take a look at the surface pattern. We'll start well up north. Let's go ahead and go to, yeah, this will be better. So here's Wyoming, here's Colorado right here, just to orient you, Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma. So we see this is from about 3 minutes ago as we're filming this. We see temperatures in the upper 50s to low 60s out here across eastern Wyoming, southeast Wyoming, and increasing to the low to mid 70s here up in northeast Wyoming into western South Dakota. Southeasterly winds at the surface with dew points in the low to mid 50s from southeast Colorado all the way up into Wyoming here and western Nebraska. Well, as we noticed here from our satellite image, we'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. We noticed lots of sunshine here in eastern Wyoming and northeast Colorado. So unhindered solar insolation going to occur today for the most part across this region. So temperatures should soar into the low to mid 80s, probably even upper 80s with unhindered insolation. And that's going to allow dew points to mix out down here, I would expect. They're in the low to mid 50s now. I would expect them to decrease a little bit throughout the day as we mix some drier air aloft. If we take a look, we'll go ahead and look at our soundings right here. This is take our Rapid City sounding. And you see the moist layer here at the surface is very, very shallow. The surface here in Rapid City is about 900 millibars. And the mixed layer, the moist layer, only goes up to just above 850 millibars, probably about 800 millibars or so. So not a very deep moist layer here at Rapid City. And we see some much drier air just above that. So as the insolation occurs, that is going to allow some turbulence to form, and we get this drier air to mix down toward the surface. So I would expect these dew points to decrease a little bit throughout the day, which is not going to be a good thing for our tornado threat especially. We see here in Denver, it's not a great moisture profile here. Pretty strange profile here in the moisture. I would expect dew points to mix out down here as well. Again, this area in full-on sunshine right now as well. So I would expect dew points to, at best, stay about the same. Probably going to mix out a little bit throughout the day. If we go back to our surface map here, we see a little bit stronger surface flow in southeast or across northeast Colorado into western Kansas and southwest Nebraska. Most of the models today, and we'll show that, have a little bit of cyclogenesis occurring down here. We'll take a look at the surface map here. These are the black lines of the pressure contours. Big time surface low already in place across southeast Montana, northern Wyoming, stretching all the way down into Colorado. We should get a little bit of cyclogenesis as we get this trough to eject and flow to traverse the Rockies here. We should get a little more cyclogenesis down here in southeast and eastern Colorado, where the flow is a little bit more southwesterly aloft. So a lot of the models have this low kind of amplifying. You're kind of getting two centers, two different low centers. One down here in southeast Wyoming, eastern Colorado, and this current one up here in southeast Montana. So interesting for the high plains. My big concern is going to be moisture today. Temperature dew point spread should be fairly high again. Temperature is going to warm into the probably the mid 80s to even upper 80s throughout the day, and we also have the Laramie range here. The surface flow, the flow is going to be throughout the atmosphere is going to be pretty much out of the south here today. We'll take a look at that in a second, but it's going to be out of the south. So we get wind going over the Laramie range here and sinking on the lee side of the Laramie range. Well, what does that do? Sinking air tends to warm. So we should get some downslope warming out here in eastern Wyoming as well, which would only act to increase temperatures and increase that temperature dew point spread. So I would expect storms to be very high based today in eastern Wyoming, as well as northeast Colorado. Especially if we get that downslope warming and we get that mixing as expected. Let's take a look at farther down south across our southern target. We actually have much better moisture down here. We see mid-60s dew points down here towards the Sweetwater, Abilene area, decreasing just slightly into the lower 60s up here into the southern Texas Panhandle, northwest Texas, into the rolling plains. So much better moisture out here, and it's kind of hard to pick out that baroclinic zone that we saw on satellite, but there does appear to be somewhat of a temperature gradient out in here. We see low to mid 70s out here across this part of north central Texas, decreasing into the 60s, the low to mid 60s up here just across the Red River in Oklahoma. So there is a little bit of a temperature gradient out here. And maybe somewhat of a wind shift. We see winds out of the east-southeast down here, and then they're more out of the due east or even east-northeast up here along the Red River. So baroclinic zone probably located somewhere in here. If I had to guess, it's kind of diffuse right now. But that's going to play a role later this evening when our dry line starts to mix east. We see our dry line located I would say roughly from the Clayton, New Mexico area down to the south, just west of Tucumcari, just east of Roswell and Artesia, and Carlsbad sitting at a 19-degree dew point. Hobbs, New Mexico sitting at 64, so the dry line definitely somewhere in here. Look at that, very dry air out here in West Texas and central New Mexico. Dew point of 9 out there in south central New Mexico. 10 out here to the west of the Pecos region. El Paso sitting at 30 degrees, so very dry air out here. So definitely a dry line out here in sort of this kind of configuration right here. But that's going to mix east a little bit today, and where it intersects this sort of diffuse frontal zone, we could get a sort of effective triple point, or we could get the formation of storms later on this afternoon. The forcing aloft is definitely not as strong down here, but I think as temperatures warm significantly behind the dry line, we'll get a very, very significant circulation along that dry line, and we'll get storms to go up down here. And again, moisture is much better out here. You can never overlook 60s dew points on the Caprock. and in the Texas Panhandle. You just can't. No matter what the wind profile, when the wind profile is. Today it's on the marginal side, but you can never overlook 62 points out here in this region of Texas. Down here again, we have sort of that that low as it amplifies. We have some extent of that extending down into eastern New Mexico, western Texas, and we'll get surface winds out of the southeast here in the Texas Panhandle. So this area would be one to watch just right off the bat here. Let's go up a little bit in the atmosphere. We'll start with 500 millibars. Right now, we see this very big amplified trough at 500 millibars here. Center of it located in southwest Idaho right now. But you can see what we were talking about. That flow aloft is pretty much out of the south up here in the northern plains. And I've seen this kind of pattern work quite often in the high plains in northeast Colorado, eastern Wyoming. But that might pose a little bit of an issue as far as storm motion relative to the most moist air. And so we'll talk about that in a second. So just keep that in mind. Down here in eastern Colorado, down toward the Texas Panhandle, we're going to get a little bit more southwesterly flow aloft, which will allow storms to move a little bit more toward the, have a little bit more of an easterly component, an eastward component. Especially down here in the Texas Panhandle. But again, down here, the farther south you go, the less influence you get from this trough, although it's a very deep trough, so even the Texas Panhandle is going to get grazed probably by the energy from this trough. But the main bulk of this energy, the vorticity center, is definitely up here somewhere in the northwestern part of the country. 700 millibars. We see very well-defined shortwave here. We can just pick out the shortwaves right now. There's one in western Utah right now, down into Arizona. Could be another one out here in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado right here. This could be another one right here from southeast Wyoming into the northern half of Nebraska. So a lot of little pieces of energy here rotating around this closed kind of trough here at 700 millibars. And we see as the day progresses here on this RAP mesoanalysis, we get kind of a reflection of that surface cyclogenesis down here. And the pressure, the height, geopotential height contours start to kink here. So very well-defined shortwave out here developing in southern Wyoming into central Colorado as the afternoon progresses. That could be a player in storm initiation later on this afternoon out here along the Laramie Range and the southern portion of the Rockies out here. 850. Let's see our low-level jet. And our low-level jet is actually displaced much well to the east of our potential target area. So that is not quite a great thing as we go on throughout the afternoon, and we see it doesn't really change that much according to this forecast. Kind of stays displaced to the east of where our storms are going to form, which is kind of the Laramie Range here in southeast Wyoming. So that could be an issue as the day goes on. And we see down here in Texas very little influence from any low-level jet, maybe 15, 20 knots at best. This particular model showing about 10 knots even at 850 in about 6 hours from now. And that's just not ideal for sustained supercell storms. Probably a multi-cell threat, mostly out here in the Texas Panhandle and southern Texas Panhandle into the rolling plains. So let's go ahead and take a look at our northern target here. So as we go on through the afternoon, let me go ahead and zoom in here to the northern target. All right, sectors aren't great, but we can still see kind of eastern Wyoming here. So again, we talked about the 500 millibar flow being pretty much due southerly. So storms are going to move from south to north pretty much. So in these kind of setups, we get storms to fire along the Laramie Range in southeast Wyoming. Now what that does, and what that's going to do, is storms are going to form here along the Laramie Range, and they're going to move due north. Well, where's our moisture axis? Well, it's pretty much out to the east. It's along the Wyoming, Nebraska, and Wyoming, South Dakota border. If we go to our models here, let's take a look just at the WRAP model here, just for simplicity. Take a look at the models more in depth here in just a sec. But here's our moisture right now. We see it kind of mixes east throughout the day. So storms are going to fire out on the Laramie Range, and they're going to move due north. Well, due north is behind the dry line. So that could be an issue, a very big issue today for this northern target. Storms will not be able to tap into the best moisture located out here to the east until much later on this afternoon. These 60s dew points are definitely convection enhanced. This is not a true representation of the surface dew point out here. But you can see the storms fire. This is an indication that they're firing by about 22Z, and they're in the dry air. They're in the dry air, and they're going to move to the north. And even if we get supercells to move to the east, which is going to need to happen for them to tap into the better moisture, probably not going to happen until 0Z, when storms are probably going to congeal into a squall line. If we can talk about storm mode here as well. Here's our dry line. For simplicity's sake, we'll say it's pretty much north-south. And remember, our 500 millibar flow, our bulk shear vectors, are pretty much exactly parallel to the dry line. The 500 millibar flow is pretty much out of the due south. Shear vector is a little bit more with a westerly component, so that might help. But still, the angle between this dry line and the bulk shear vector is pretty much parallel, and that is not a good thing for storm mode considerations. So I would expect storms to go up on the dry line and kind of move into each other here and congeal pretty quickly as they form. So we have lots of negatives going for us in this northern target into Wyoming. Storm mode, definitely a concern here. I would expect maybe 1 or 2 hours at most that storms stay discrete. But the problem is they're going to be behind the dry line, and we're going to get temperatures warming into the mid-80s probably throughout the day. This model showing, temperatures in the low to mid-80s out here over eastern Wyoming by this afternoon. And we get storms forming in 30, 40 dew points. Those temperature dew point spreads are just not conducive for tornadoes, and they are more conducive for very outflow dominant storms. And one thing to note here, the SPC mentioned it yesterday, but the storm's going to be moving to the north. Outflow probably going to be moving out to the northeast. So with the northward storm motion, storms are going to struggle to stay out ahead of their outflow, which is going to probably be produced pretty prolifically given the high cloud bases, high temperature dew point spreads. So just not liking this northern target at all for tornadoes. Again, it's the high plains, so you can never rule out anything, especially along the Laramie Range here. You can never rule out anything. So I would not be shocked to see a very high-based tornado out there today. That's, of course, extremely photogenic, but just not really liking what I'm seeing out here in the this Wyoming target for today as far as tornadoes go. I think storms are going to be pretty messy pretty quickly, and they will be pretty high-based as well. So outflow dominance is going to be definitely a concern up there today. But it's the high plains, so you never know. Down here in Colorado is a little bit more conditional, but a little bit more interesting. If we look down here, let's look at our WRAP model here. This is 500 millibars. We see our flow is just a little bit more southwesterly here in Colorado. So that could bode well for storms moving off of this dry line and staying a little bit more discrete. Again, our low-level jet is not forecast to be really over this region, but we do get some semblance of it building back in eastern Colorado by 0Z this evening. So that could be interesting as we move into this evening in Colorado. And our moisture seems to be a little bit, just a little bit better quality down here at least. If we go back to our surface map and get our Central Plains sector, it's about the same. it's about the same down here. Do we expect surface temperatures to get as high out here? Let's go ahead and look at what this wrap model is showing. Um, it's hard to say. Probably about the same. So probably not that much difference. Not as much as I was thinking and as I saw last night. So temperature dew point spread is probably going to be pretty high out here. Um, but 80, 82 over 55 dew points. I've seen it do crazy stuff in Colorado before. Let's go ahead and look at 700 millibar temperature just while I'm thinking of it. And this could be the issue. We see 700 temperatures a little bit higher down here, indicative of a little bit stronger of a cap down here in Colorado. It's definitely a more conditional threat if we can get storms to fire. But I do think they will be a little bit have a little bit better chance to stay discreet down here. And when you have the Palmer Divide in play, you always take a look at the Palmer Divide. It's not going to be a classic DCVZ day, Denver cyclonic convergence or Denver convergence vorticity zone. Since our surface flow is not really southeasterly here, it's a little bit more southerly. There could be some semblance of it forming later on this afternoon. So wouldn't rule out a rogue sort of land spout or something from any storm that forms down there. But it's going to be similar to up here in the Wyoming target. Pretty high base storms, but the capping concerns down here is kind of twofold. It'll keep storm coverage to a minimum down here, I think. So we might get maybe 1 or 2 supercells to form down here if the cap can be breached. But it's also, on the other side of that, the cap could be too strong to let storms form down here. But I would definitely eye down here in Colorado where the moisture is better than where your storms are forming in Wyoming and riding just to the north in kind of the worst moisture up here. They'll be riding a little bit more to the northeast up here, and so they'll stay in that moisture longer. And so could get a nice surprise out there in Colorado today. I think if I were chasing up here and I was staying the night, say in Scotts Bluff or North Platte, I would maybe gamble down here in Colorado. I think it's definitely worth the gamble. I just don't like the Wyoming target at all today, and I might make the gamble down here in Colorado. Let's take a look at the Texas target. Let's go back to our mesoanalysis down here, and we'll change sectors. So surface flow we see out of the east. We can get a little bit of upslope flow here on the cap rock, which is always a good thing. But surface winds are relatively weak, 5 to 10 knots out here in the southern Texas Panhandle into the rolling plains. Our 500 millibar flow, again, it's going to be kind of a glancing blow, fairly weak winds aloft, 20 to 30 knots here. If we go to our wrap model here, just for simplicity, go to the southern plains, we see throughout the day, just kind of a real glancing blow. Winds remain about 20, 25 knots out here throughout the day. They do kind of increase as the evening rolls around to about 30 knots. Very, very marginal upper level winds for supercells down here today, but it is the cap rock. It does have 60s dew points on it, so could definitely see a rogue little storm go nuts down here. But again, we have that baroclinic zone. We have a possible shortwave down here extending into the Texas Panhandle that could help things get going. Our low-level jet, though, very, very weak, as we talked about, but does build in after dark. Does build in into the Texas Panhandle after dark. But will it really make a difference? Storms will probably fire somewhere out here near the Lubbock vicinity, move east. They'll probably be out here already kind of congealed due to the probably outflow dominant nature of these storms. Our dew points down here into the 60s. But again, weak winds aloft don't allow the precipitation to fall outside of that updraft and keep that updraft free precipitation. So that promotes outflow dominance as well. Just like the higher cloud bases can promote outflow dominance, weak winds aloft also promote outflow dominance because the updraft is hindered by the precipitation that falls in it, and so storms get cold and outflowy pretty fast. But you never know. Moisture is definitely better out here. Shear profiles, again, are pretty weak. 20 to 25 knots, maybe increasing to about 30 knots as we go into the afternoon. So definitely marginal as far as supercells go. I would expect a multi-cell mode to kind of be favored out here, but it is the cap rock. It does have great moisture on it. Instability on this model at least increasing above 2,500 to 3,000 here. So you never know out here. I would expect multi-cells to dominate, but I've seen worse setups produce tornadoes in the Texas Panhandle and West Texas. So would definitely keep an eye out there. Let's go ahead and pull some soundings from these regions, some forecast soundings, just to take a look. We'll start down here since we're already down here. This is the WRAP model. Again, you can see evidence of that baroclinic zone right here, moisture kind of pooling along it. We have 70s dew points just waiting out here, just south of the Red River toward DFW and Wichita Falls. Let's take a sounding right here, right along that baroclinic zone or differential heating zone. And again, we see very large cape. Cape upwards of 3,800 mixed layer cape. That's very, very high. Steep lapse rates aloft, so likely a hail threat with any storm that forms. But look at our wind profile. That's just very, very weak winds aloft. Very small photographs, but there is some curvature into this photograph, so we could see a brief supercell or two down here, but with bulk shear only about 24 knots. Down here, I would expect multi-cells to reign supreme down here. But again, it's the cap rock. You never know. Let's go up here to our Wyoming target. This is about initiation time. We'll take one out here just right along the dry line. And yeah, just look at very, very much inverted V profiles here. Would promote outflow dominance with these storms. We do have decently steep lapse rates aloft, though. Steep lapse rates aloft. So I would expect large hail and damaging winds to be the main threat up here as we get strong downbursts in these kind of inverted V profiles. This is 23Z. I'll try to take a sounding out here that's not convectively contaminated. This one's not bad. 75 over 53 up here in East Wyoming, with some curvature in the low levels, but it just is not a great setup. I really don't think much is going to happen up here today, and you know, it is Wyoming, so you can't rule anything out. But it just does not look like a classic high plains tornado day up there today. But I could be wrong. Then this Colorado target is interesting as well. Let's take a sounding right here. That would be probably just southeast of Lyman. We see very much more curvature in the photographs down here, as opposed to up north, where we have a little bit more southwesterly flow aloft. Again, high cloud bases down here, so any storm that forms should be high based. But we see a little bit of capping here in this sounding down here, according to at least this model, which is the WRAP model. So storm threat definitely more conditional down here. Let's do a little model dive here. This is the NAM from this morning. Very similar progression at this point. Now, one thing to note here is that forcing does tend to increase across eastern Wyoming over just after dark. So what that could do is promote even more of an MCS to develop as forcing increases aloft here synoptically. Storms that likely will already be in the process of congealing will definitely be aided in the MCS process by this increased forcing here right at and just after dark. Let's take a look at what the NAM is doing with our moisture. Again, here's Wyoming, Colorado right here. And it looks like a little bit better moisture here by the NAM. We get a little bit of pooling along the Laramie Range, which is something to keep in mind. So a little bit of model discrepancy here. And this could definitely get it done. 21Z would be about go time, I think, about the time for storm initiation out here. Spread 77 over 59, so the NAM definitely not warming things up as much down here. Let's go to 0Z, see if we can get a sounding that's not convectively contaminated here. This would be in western Nebraska, and there's some curvature to this photograph. It's a little bit contaminated here, so take this with a grain of salt, but a little bit more curvature here than we saw with the wrap, but it's definitely marginal for tornadoes. Large hail, damaging winds, again, probably the main threat with these storms, given the steep lapse rates aloft and decently high temperature dew point spreads. But the NAM it's interesting to note that the NAM is not warming as much out here. Yeah, NAM is warming into the mid 70s only here, which is interesting to note. I wonder if it is showing a little bit more cloud cover out here. I never take these cloud cover models, these cloud cover products very seriously, but it's something we can look at. And it keeps it clear for most of the day. So that's interesting. NAM is definitely keeping temperatures down into the 70s, which is interesting to note. But this is 12Z, 15Z would be 10 a.m. It has temperatures in the low to mid 60s here in Colorado, or eastern Wyoming, excuse me. Let's take a look at our surface map. And we see temperatures a little bit warmer than the NAM is showing. We see low 70s up here in northeast Wyoming. The NAM is showing mid 60s up here in northeast Wyoming. And then down here, southeast Wyoming, 61, 62. And we see temperatures about 63 to 66 out here in that same region. So the NAM is running a little bit cold, I think, this morning. So that could be why we're seeing a little bit more robust moisture, not as much mixing out here, not as high temperature dew point spreads. But if the NAM, if this does come to fruition, there would be an enhanced tornado threat, I do believe, out here in eastern Wyoming. But I am taking this with a grain of salt, since we're already seeing temperatures warm a little bit more than what the NAM is showing here at 15Z, which is 10 a.m. Central Time, 9 a.m. up there. So a little leery of the NAM, definitely. We can also take a look at the HRR, the HRR model. We'll look at some convective allowing products here, the convective products here in a sec. This is the 12Z run. This is the central sector. Let's see what it's doing with moisture. This is the normal HRR. We can take a look at the V4 in a second. Yeah, and the HRR is definitely mixing out the moisture pretty significantly as the afternoon progresses. Dew points, yeah, in the lower 50s out here, just to the east of the dry line. Storms form just to the west of the dry line. That's just not going to be good. Let's see the surface temperature field out here. Yeah, it's warming it up into the mid to upper 80s out here. So that is definitely not going to bode well for storms to be a little bit lower based. They're definitely going to be high based out here. The HRR does kind of have a tendency to overmix sometimes, but I think this scenario is probably pretty good. I don't know if temperatures will make it all the way into the upper 80s. I would think low to mid 80s, but still that is going to allow your cloud bases to spike and your storms to be outflow dominant mostly. Let's look at our last model here for moisture, and then we'll look at some of the convective products here. Let's see what surface temperatures do here. Yep, the HRR V4 showing somewhat similar things, low to mid 80s out here, which I think this is probably a pretty good representation. I think low to mid 80s is probably what we're going to see. And yeah, we see that dry line, that moisture mixing out to the east, storms firing behind the dry line. Storms are firing here, dry line is here. So I think the storm's going to move due north. So yeah, definitely looks like kind of an outflow dominant storm situation. Storms will probably congeal into a line up here in Wyoming. Would keep an eye on Colorado, definitely. That dry line does mix east in Colorado, but it kind of sharpens and stays kind of right there. And you can definitely get a storm out here in the Lyman area or just south and move to the northeast throughout the afternoon. But definitely concerned up here for this Wyoming target. Let's take a look at some of the convective products. We'll start up here. Here's Wyoming. Let's see what it does. And yeah, firestorms there about 20Z, 3 o'clock. Here's 21Z, and yeah, pretty much right away they're outflow dominant and congealing into a line. We do get some secondary development down here in extreme southeast Wyoming by about 2Z, which would be 8 o'clock up there. Still light up there. So these would be somewhat interesting. These would be kind of in the better moisture. So I would if this comes to fruition, I would definitely look down here later on this evening for maybe a surprise down there at sunset. Colorado stays dry, so probably showing a little bit better capping down here, a little bit increased capping down here in Colorado, which is why storms are not firing down here. And our Texas target, yeah, you can see a lot of storms form, mostly multicells, no really long updraft helicity tracks here. And again, we saw the shear pretty marginal out here, so would expect storms to be multicell out here and kind of congeal into a complex that moves to the east overnight tonight. How about the regular HRRR? What is the regular HRRR showing? This is the latest run, 14Z. So I believe the upper air data has been input into the this model by now. We see about 20Z. We get storm formation here in eastern Wyoming. A lot more storms, and this showing a pretty messy storm mode out here again. Just looks, yeah, storms look to be outflow dominant. Also showing storms to fire kind of down south by about sunset. Would watch definitely down here for any surprises that might happen. But yeah, storms just look outflow dominant and kind of congealed here by sunset, by early evening. Interesting. This HRRR model is firing storms down here in southeast Colorado, which is interesting. We'll see if any other model shows that. But that could be a target to look for if that comes to fruition, which is probably unlikely. We'll see if we have any backup, any support from the other models. Texas Panhandle target by about 21, 22Z, we get storms to form. They're mostly multicellular and form it into a complex that approaches southwest Oklahoma. By the evening, you can see the outflow surging out ahead of that complex. Out there, let's go ahead and look at the Wharf ARW model. This is the Central Plains again. Here's Wyoming up here. As we go through the day, we see the storms to fire and kind of get messy pretty quickly. Again, probably 1 to 2 hours, maybe they'll stay discrete here, but with the outflow dominant nature of the storms, they'll probably congeal pretty significantly as the afternoon progresses. And this model also showing development down here along the kind of tri-state area between Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. So again, would watch that area pretty closely throughout the day. If you're chasing the Wyoming target, I would definitely look down there. Again, eastern Colorado stays dry here, so probably a bit the cap is looking to win out here. Southern Plains target, we get lots of storms we get some storms to fire here by about 23Z in this model, and then kind of congeal into a complex after sunset. Last model here, we'll go back here. Last model we'll look at here, NSSL Wharf. Let's start with Southern Plains target. We're already here. Storms fire a little bit farther west in this model, but congeal pretty quickly. No big updraft helicity streaks. Again, marginal shear down here. Probably outflow dominant storms. You can see that outflow right surging out ahead of the storms there. So probably a large hail and damaging wind threat. Mostly a damaging wind threat down here later on. Large hail threat early on in the life cycle. Let's go up to the Central Plains target. And we see storms fire about 20Z here. Might stay semi-discrete for an hour or two before they really congeal into a line in eastern Wyoming. Now this is interesting. This model, NSSL Wharf, does fire a storm out here in eastern Colorado. It's the only model that's showing it, but again, this would probably be the target I'd gamble on today. A cap might be a little bit too high down there, but at least we have some semblance of initiation from at least one of these models. So that piques my interest a little bit for this Colorado target, that it does have a discrete supercell for a couple hours before it kind of becomes outflow dominant and loses steam after dark or at sunset. So that is interesting. So again, targets today would be eastern Wyoming, probably mostly a wind threat, damaging wind threat as we go towards sunset. We could have an hour or two window for discrete supercells, but again, they're forming in the worst moisture out here to the west of the dry line. And it's going to be there by the time they move into the better moisture, they'll probably be already congealed into a squall line. But early on, could see a surprise tornado maybe. It would be extremely photogenic if it did form, but probably large hail threat as well. But then it will transition to a damaging wind threat as the afternoon goes on. Much more conditional threat here in Colorado, but I think the storm is actually going to form in the moisture to the east of the dry line. So would be definitely interested out here for a little bit of Colorado magic to happen. Probably large hail and damaging winds in any downburst that happens due to the high cloud bases. But I wouldn't rule out a tornado down here as well. Again, it would be very photogenic if it did form. Southern Plains target, Texas Panhandle target, would expect multi-cell mode to reign supreme down here, but would expect large hail and damaging winds given the steep lapse rates aloft, but outflow dominant nature to the storms given the fairly weak shear aloft. But it is the cap rock, so you never know out here with 62 points on the cap rock. We do have a surface boundary to contend with, a very diffuse surface boundary to contend with, so that could help things out. Maybe we get a brief supercell structure or two down here, but I think multicells down here mostly. If you're chasing out there today, good luck to you. Hope you see something. Could be easily a high plains magic kind of day, although there are some drawbacks to the setup. So good luck out there. We have a couple of probably decent chase days coming up. We'll hopefully be back with some more videos regarding the setups for those starting tomorrow and going into this weekend down here in the Southern Plains. Could be a fruitful weekend for storm chasers out there this weekend. So thank you very much for watching. Sorry if I rambled on a little bit. There was a lot to go over today with multiple different targets. But thank you for watching. Thanks for sticking around. And if you're chasing today, good luck, stay safe, and I will see you under the next mezzo.